Time for Clash of the Classics.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Clash of the Classics. Today's feature is made possible by our friends at the Automatic Transmission Rebuilders Association. ATRA is the largest and they're the oldest transmission network in the world. If you're experiencing transmission problems of any kind, or you have a transmission question, before you do anything, visit them at atra.com. All right, let's jump right into it. I'm Donnie. I'll be your host for today's Classic Showdown, and we're going to have some fun today. The 1963 Buick Wildcat battles that 1963 Ford Galaxie. And I want to start with that Buick. Now, back in 1963, GM used a few sort of deliberate terms to describe the new Wildcat, and they were smooth, powerful, and quiet. The lines were clean and had sort of a unique elegance that was pretty typical for Buick back in those days. We're going to talk about some of the tastefulness of this car over the next few minutes. And I think most will agree that the Wildcat for 1963 was, and actually remains today, pretty remarkable automobile. The interior was well appointed, the 401 Nailhead V8 was plenty powerful, and that silky smooth performance of the Dynaflow-based transmission that we'll talk a little bit more about later on, all made for a great combination of power and comfort. 1963 was the first year that the Wildcat was its own series. No longer was it a sub-series of the Invicta line. And Buick's marketing division predicted the car would be well received, and it turns out they were spot on with their predictions because Buick sold over 35,000 Wildcats back in 1963. Just over 6,000 were convertibles. There were somewhere near 12,000 two-door sport coupes, and the rest were four-door hardtops. As with all General Motors full-sized B-body models, all three body styles of the Wildcat accommodated 6 passengers in absolute comfort and luxury. And while the Wildcat's exterior styling may be somewhat conservative, there are several sort of subtle details throughout the exterior that I think give it a distinctive look. The entire grille opening is framed with fluted silver metal paneling that's capped off with a polished stainless steel molding on top that accentuates the whole grille area. Even the bumper has a great shape and style to it. With the panel, there are 3 separate horizontal vents that are Buick's Ventiport styling theme. Polished moldings around each wheel opening and then down around the lower portion of the rocker panels really add a pretty nice touch. The body sits on the same steel X-frame that Pontiac used on their 1959 and their 1960 models, which, by the way, is the same frame design that Chevy used on their 59 through 1964 full-size models. And unlike a lot of other full-perimeter frames, the X-frame did not have side rails, so all the rigidity came from the frame intersection at the middle of the car. As far as the body was concerned, it was supported front and rear via stout coil springs. Under the hood was Buick's famous Nailhead engine. It was a 401 cubic inch V8 with a Rochester 4-barrel carburetor, 10 1/4 1 compression ratio, producing a pretty respectable 325 horsepower and an amazing 440 pound-feet of torque. The only other engine that was available was the optional 340 horsepower 425 cubic inch V8. And when it came to transmissions, Buick offered a couple choices. The turbine drive was standard equipment and easily the most popular choice. But also available for the first time back in those days was an optional BorgWarner T10 4-speed manual. Thing is not many buyers chose it. In fact, only 346 cars were built in 1963 using that manual transmission. Can't imagine what a Survivor Wildcat with a T10 would be worth these days. But as far as the turbine drive was concerned, Buick had used it in the Invicta and the Wildcat since 1960. It was the final version of the original Dynaflow, and 1963 was the last year that Buick used it. And when it came to options, the Wildcat was loaded with them. It's got AC, AM/FM Buick radio, power windows, remote trunk opener, which I thought was pretty cool, tinted glass, safety padded lower dash panel, speedometer with a speed minder, and power driver seat. There were actually 3 different driver seat options, 4, 6, or 8 position seats. And in the center was a really nice crafted full-length console with ribbed stainless steel paneling. Then at the head of the console was a factory-equipped tachometer, which is part of the Wildcat's sort of sport appeal. Its red line was right at 5,000 RPM mark. Some of the other items that came standard on all Wildcats included the deluxe steering wheel, Full wheel covers, license plate frames, there was center console, padded instrument panel, foam rubber headliner, electric clock, and a courtesy lamp in the trunk. As far as the overall feel of the drive goes, when you stab the accelerator, there's an immediate response from the 401 V8. The car weighed somewhere near 4,200 pounds, and even at that size, it accelerated pretty impressively. There was a bit of an unfamiliar feel with it, as there were no upshifts of gears present, kind of like you'd find in a conventional automatic. It's just a steady flowing, kind of an uninterrupted turbine-like smoothness. It's a remarkable feeling, and it's one that you can easily get used to. And speaking about an automatic transmission that feels great, I want to talk about the largest automatic transmission network on the planet. They're the Automatic Transmission Rebuilders Association. ATRA makes our Clash of the Classics possible. No one knows transmissions better than ATRA. With a member network stretching from coast to coast, there's no better place to be when your car is experiencing transmission trouble than an authorized ATRA service provider. Find an ATRA service provider near you at atra.com. All right, now let's get into that 1963 Ford Galaxie. The 1963 model was essentially unchanged from 1962, except for some freshening and some aesthetic trim. The windshields were reshaped and a four-door hardtop 500 XL was added. A lower fastback roofline was added around mid-year to give the car a bit of a more sleek look and make the big cars more competitive on the NASCAR track, with less drag and better aerodynamics at high speed. The 1963 and a half model, which incidentally was the industry's first official half-year model, was called the Sports Hardtop, or some people called it a fastback. The decision ended up being a profitable one for Ford because the new sports hardtop models easily outsold the older box top or the square roof models. The sports hardtop was available in both Galaxie 500 and Galaxie 500 XL trim. By the way, Mercury also received the new roofline under the Marauder badge in Monterey, Montclair, and the Park Lane models. And one side note that I thought was at least worth mentioning was in 1963, Ford offered a stripped-down model called the Ford 300. It was a no-frills big Ford priced around $100 below the base Galaxie sedans. It was mostly used by taxi companies and some police departments. It was offered for $1963 and $1963 only. It was replaced by the Custom Series in 1964. At the beginning of the 1963 model run, the 292 Y-block V8 was replaced as the base V8 engine with the Fairlane's new small block 260. The only problem with the 260 was it was a little too anemic for the heavy, full-size Ford and ended up getting scrapped in favor of the 289. In fact, the engine revision happened right about the same time the 63 and a half models were introduced. At that point, the 289 was quickly becoming the go-to engine in the Ford small block series. The 260 continued to be offered on the Ford Falcon Sprint, and then later, around mid-1964, it was available in the early version of the 1965 Mustang. Then shortly after that, the 260, which was, I guess, somewhat disappointing in terms of performance, was replaced by the 289 in all models. Ford continued to offer the FE Series 352 in the 1963 full-size, as well as 3 versions of the 390 V8. When it came to transmission options, there were a total of 5 different choices offered for 1963. First one was a 3-speed manual with a column shift, which was standard on most models. Then secondly, there was a heavy-duty Borg-Warner 4-speed manual. That was standard on the big 406 V8. A 3-speed manual with overdrive was optional, but that was rarely ordered. Fourth choice was the 2-speed Ford-O-Matic, which was common on the 6-cylinder and some of the small block V8s. And in fifth place, the 3-speed Cruise-O-Matic transmission, which was common for the majority of the 352 and the 390 engines. And believe it or not, there were also several different rear-end ratios. That, along with 5 transmissions we just talked about, and about 8 different engines, and all of a sudden, there were a huge number of different driveline combinations for 1963. Of all the choices and combinations that were available, easily the most produced combination for the Galaxie and Galaxie 500 was the 352 V8 with the Cruise-O-Matic 3-speed and the 3.0 rear end ratio. Also in 1963, Ford discontinued using the Club, Town, and Victoria monikers for the different body styles and then replaced it with the generic 2-door, 4-door, and hardtop designation. For me, it's a bit of a tough decision between these two cars. My wife's grandfather had the Buick, and my late sister drove a 63 Galaxie for years, so I kind of like them both. But as always, we'd like to know which car you prefer. But thanks for hanging out with us today. That's just about all the time we have. Big thanks to everyone at the Automatic Transmission Rebuilders Association. ATRA makes our Clash of the Classics features possible. Next time you've got a transmission problem or you've got a transmission question, check them out at atra.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.